I tell people that, I mean, obviously MPE is a fantastic program from an educational standpoint, but
Right.
I think the reason, because I thought for a while when I was in high school, like, oh, should I just go to like a technical school and learn the recording stuff and then take lessons on the side and save some money, because we all know Berklee's not cheap. But really, Berklee is an advantageous school because of the connections, because of the alumni, and because, I mean, I have so many friends, a lot of them from MPE, but also performance friends who, you know, graduated around the same time I did, who were, a lot of them are out here working, doing stuff. I collaborate with them sometimes, you know, just the network of students, of alumni, and then you guys too, all the professors who have connections out here. I mean, I'm not sure if I would have been in the same place in LA if it wasn't for those 2 summer breaks I took with Joe James into these LA trips. That was like the first 2 years he did that, I think.
Right.
It was still like unsanctioned. It was just like a sort of thing we did on the side with Joe, just touring all the studios out here and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, the connections are everything. February 2010, I finally made the move out here. I drove out from Boston to LA, and a hot second away from being another Berklee MPE intern at Interscope in Santa Monica, because Joe and Ed, the manager of Interscope, are like old best buddies. So a lot of I'm pretty sure their entire staff is basically Berklee MPE students. But I really wanted to get into score mixing film music, which is what I do now. So I had emailed as many people as I could find emails for score mixers, which back then, 2009, 2010, wasn't many. I think I only emailed like 5 engineers. And this one guy, Greg Townley, actually got back to me and was like, yeah, give me a call. And I called him, and he tried to like put the fear of God in me at first. He's like, LA's the mecca of engineers. You got to be really good. Everyone comes here to do this. It's a really like, you know, tough thing. He's like listing off all these things he wants me to know. You got to know how to like work in 5.1 and surround in Pro Tools at 2 rigs. They're synced together, you know, and I'm like writing all this stuff down. Like, okay, I'll study all this.
Now, were you contacting him for work or just to get tips on how to have a career?
I mean, both. I mean, ultimately, I wanted a gig, but it was like, if you have some advice to give me, I'll take that too. But if you're looking for something, he's like, well, I don't know. He's like, give me another call when you're actually here. And that's another thing for students looking to move to somewhere, especially LA. At least when I moved out here, it's really hard. You can't really line up a gig ahead of time. It's really hard. Like, because people are like, if you're not here, like, usually someone needs an assistant like next week, you know, so you kind of have to be here, which is hard.
Absolutely.
So I didn't even fly out here. I remember my first place in LA, I found this place called the Entertainers Launching Pad on Craigslist up in the valley. And it was like $350 a month, and it was basically like a house with 2 big rooms at the end with bunk beds, girls end, boys end. Everyone else there were like, they wanted to be rock stars or actors. I was the one like engineer, but that was all I could line up before, because I didn't fly out here to like get an apartment ahead of time. So that was also tough. Like, it's definitely it can be a tough move. I called Greg and I was like, hey man, like, I'm moving to LA next week. Like, can we meet up? He's like, yeah, sure. We'll grab coffee. Like, let me know when you're here. And went to meet him and have coffee, and we chatted, and he was like, yeah, he's like, I actually have a lot of work coming up and I need an assistant. And he put me down in front of one of his big, trailer music, 250, 300 plus track sessions, and just had me tell him what was going on. And I was like, oh, I see these tracks are routed this stem without reverb, and, yada, yada. And after enough of that, he's like, okay, Pro Tools enough. He was like, you don't do any drugs, right? Other than weed? Okay, cool. You got the gig. That's literally what he told me. So I lucked out that I kind of bypassed the internship phase that most people go through.
Good.
October of that year, I was double referred by both Greg and another engineer I'd been assisting to a composer named Trevor Morris, who was looking for a tech, basically. So I kind of pivoted. I didn't love it, but I pivoted into basically being his like composer tech. So I had to learn Logic and Vienna Ensemble Pro and how to fix his VST instruments, contact instruments. He had like a 4-computer composer set up with a bunch of sample tanks, a Pro Tools print rig, a big sequencer. He's working on film and TV composing. And basically I told him, I was like, well, yeah, I'm totally down to, put that time in, but eventually I want to be Alan Meyerson, basically. I want to be like a film music mixer. And at the time, he was also planning on building a studio in Santa Monica, which he did, which is actually only 4 blocks away from Remote Control, Hans's place. So I stayed with Trevor for about 4.5 years. It was just like tech, and then we built a System 5 based mix room at the new studio that I got. I actually set it all up wiring wise. I had to figure out what Pro Tools rigs to get, set them all up, do all of the, non-electrical wiring. It was a lot of work, but it was a really great learning experience. So I basically had to assemble a System 5 console, 2 Pro Tools rigs, the monitors, get a guy to come tune the room, get it all working. And then I had to assist Sean Murphy in the studio I had set up. And he's like, one of my heroes because he's a huge engineer, score mixer. So that was a big learning curve to get that all ready to mix this big movie. And then we moved all that stuff into this new studio in Santa Monica. Then after a few months, I eventually shifted. I was doing both for a while. I was like his tech assistant and also doing whatever mixing, engineering, editing stuff I could do in the mix room, which is really what I wanted to do. And eventually it was just too much work to do both. So he hired another tech, and that was a revolving door, people coming in to be his tech. Well, then I was fully kind of his staff engineer mixer. I think cable pays better up front. Yep. Like they usually pay a fee per episode, and the royalties are where it's different. Like I know that the guy that does like NCIS, which is the most watched network show these days, I mean makes tons in royalties because network royalties. If you get a show, especially if it's a syndicated show. All right, my clients tell me because I do a lot of streaming stuff now.
Right.
That streaming's a mess royalties wise because there's they don't really release their numbers. They're really stodgy. Netflix won't say how many views. They know internally, but legally they don't actually have to tell anybody. And I don't think only recently they made deals with ASCAP and BMI and CSAC about how to report numbers so they can actually calculate royalties. And whatever the royalties are, they're crap compared to cable and network. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's kind of and their composers are trying to. I don't know if it's legislation, but I think they're trying to push the performing rights organizations to put their foot down and try to get some standards because it's unprecedented. There's no standards for streaming because it's still considered new media.
Yeah, it's like
and that was the big
same thing.
Yeah.
So you moved to LA when again? In 2010?
March 2010. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and then you got your big break shortly thereafter. Well,
I mean, technically, I was still like, taking his checks to his accountant and getting coffee and taking lunch orders. And I, even though I technically skipped the intern phase with that first assistant job, I ended up doing intern kind of stuff for Trevor. And that's another thing I'm sure.
Was it paying enough?
I've heard this a lot. That's, I mean, it wasn't much, but at least it was a steady salary.
And you didn't have to take a gig as a waiter or anything.
I mean, I couldn't. It was beyond full time. That's how the film and music industry is kind of known for that. It's you assist someone. It's like you're on call 24 hours a day. It can be pretty brutal. But I did that for 4.5 years, and the good thing was that mix room we had in Santa Monica. Not only was I working in there, it's just me doing stuff for Trevor, but we would rent that room out to other productions. Right. So a lot of other big composers would rent that because it was a really good mixer. It was like at that time, a System 5 console with 2 Pro Tools rigs and in 5.1. That was like what all score mixers wanted to work with, and there weren't many studios like that available to do that kind of work. Because this is still back when we still kind of used the console. It was before everything just went totally into Pro Tools. So I basically, even though I was on staff with Trevor, we would book these mix sessions, and I ran the session. I was the assistant, had to set it up. I would do all the Pro Tools work unless they had a Pro Tools op they brought in. So I got to watch all these big name score mixers do their stuff, and I got to see the variety of how there's similarities to how everyone mixes a film score, but there's a lot of differences too. So I got to see, a lot of different ways of doing it and just, make connections that way and so on and so forth. So then April of 2015 is when I went freelance. So I've been freelance now for almost 7 years, I guess.
So now 2015, you go freelance, and then now you have your own room now. So you go freelance. What does that mean? How are you working now? Who are you working for?
I mean, it was terrifying to walk away from, even though I wasn't getting paid very well by Trevor. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was steady. It was a salary. Right. So it was definitely terrifying to drop that. And fortunately, Trevor was cool about it. I mean, he's like, it had been long enough. He's like, you're ready to move on. So he kept hiring me, fortunately, to do his stuff just from my room, or I would go in as a freelancer and mix the same things I was doing for him at that studio for a while. And then I had met enough other people that I had just enough contacts to do some work. But I mean, it was tough for the first 3, 4, 5, 6 months. I think I eventually when I was facing my first empty hole in my calendar, which now I'm just used to it. I'm just like, the schedule is just constantly changing. But I know at this point now it'll get filled in eventually. Yeah, I did drive Uber for like a few days because I was just like, I have nothing booked for the next 2 months. But then I did that for 2 days and then more stuff booked. And then I was like, oh, okay, now I can not do that anymore.
I remember those days, man.
Yeah. But then my first big break as a freelancer, I was finishing up doing a synth recording session. We used to work a lot with this guy, Steve Tavoloni, who,
Steve.
He's a woodwind player. Yeah, but now he's really known for all the synth stuff he does. You know, he was part of Thomas Newman's band. He would do all the synth.
Tell him I say hello.
I will. Yeah, I haven't seen him in ages. I got to call him again.
All right.
But yeah, Steve would come in and I would engineer and produce those sessions with him. We were just finishing up a session with Trevor, and I had already been freelance. And then somebody from STX Studios, which is now a big film studio, but at the time it was really early, knew Trevor and called him. He's like, "Hey man, we got our first film we're doing. The composers don't have a mixer and the score needs to be mixed. Like, can I get a buddy rate on your mix studio? And then we got to find an engineer." And Trevor wanted to get good inroads with. He's the head of music for STX, so he's wants to get work from us. He's like, Jason, like, just use the mixer for free. And like, my guy Phil just went freelance. He'll give you a great rate. Just use him. And that ended up being Danny Bensi and Sandra Jurians, who are now probably 70-80% of my work now is with them. They're the guys who do Ozark. That's the biggest thing we're doing with them now. But I mean, I just finished.
I just started watching season 4, bro.
Yeah.
Listen, I
finally got a screen credit for that. They didn't give me a screen credit for a while, but now you can see my name at the end.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. But those guys. So I mean that they're like my main guys now. They're just doing tons and tons of work, lots of TV, mostly all streaming and some HBO stuff, films. Right. So that was 3, 4, 5 months into going freelance, and it didn't. I mean, it wasn't a huge amount of work to begin with. They grew as but I became their guy, and then. Once you kind of get your foot in the door with the niche that I'm in, because score mixing really is a niche. There's not really. I was having a chat a few years ago with an agent who represents a few score mixers, and she was like, if you really think about it, when you're talking about stuff that people have heard of, Netflix shows, cable shows, theatrical films, like big projects, there's really only probably 50 to 100 score mixers in the world working on that stuff. There's a handful in London, obviously a bunch here in LA, maybe a couple of random people like on the East Coast that are doing a few things, but there's really it's kind of a specialty, because you kind of have to know orchestral music. It helps to be able to sort of read a score, but then you have to know all the mixing stuff that everyone knows. But then also it's have to know about surround sound, about time code and video stuff, and it's kind of a handful of different skills. But once I wedged myself into that niche, and you get more and more experience, and it's just word of mouth at that point. Now I get people just referring me like, "Oh hey, yeah, I'm Phil mixed my score for this thing. Why don't you try him if you need somebody?" Yeah. And now it's like I'm at the point now where I'm having to pass off work to other people because I'm getting overbooked, and it's hard for me to find someone else who I know is qualified because it's such a specialty. But you were talking earlier too about about being cool, and Trevor used to always talk about it. He's like you're a really good assistant on all these sessions because you're a good hang. That's what he would say, and that is more than true. Like I would any artist or engineer who's looking for an assistant, they'd much rather have someone who's 20% less good at Pro Tools, for example, but is a much better person personality-wise than some whiz kid who has an attitude who won't like go make a pot of coffee or like do little things here and there. That's so huge, especially as engineers. Like if you're a pop star diva, sure, maybe people will put up with your shit and you can like be a diva and get through. But as anyone lower in the totem pole, engineers, session musicians, orchestrators, whatever, like no, people, it doesn't matter how amazing you are. Eventually people will not put up with your crap. They just, it's just, we're in dark rooms for 12, 14, 16 hours a day sometimes. Like we don't want people that are, not cool to hang out with or just not chill. So if you have a certain thing you do, and a lot of people like that, but you're a pain in the ass to work with in the studio, they're not going to care about that. Like there's tons of other people. Sure, they might not sound exactly like your mixes sound, but that doesn't matter at the end of the day. Like when you send your mixes to the dub stage, you're going to, oh, score sounds good. Done. It's not like they're not going to necessarily nerd out about some particular sound that you brought to the score.
Exactly.
Or the mix. Same thing with mixing records or whatever it is.
Sure.
Like moving to LA, it's expensive. I mean, and it's just getting more expensive. It was hard when I moved here, and it's probably even harder now. But I still think you have a massive leg up if you're here. Even though technically I sit here in my room by myself, get files from Dropbox, mix stuff, print mixes, upload them to Dropbox, get notes by email, and I never see my clients anymore, even before the pandemic. Yeah. Like 95% of my mixes, I'm just here by myself. They don't even come, even though they're in LA, they don't even come here because they're too busy. But even though we have the technology to work remotely like that, to get started, to get those important connections we were talking about, I think it's so much easier here. And also, if there's two mixers and they're about at the same experience level, and one's, a 30-minute drive from you and the other one's halfway around the world, they're probably going to want the person they can go sit with if they need to, or who is in the same time zone as them and things like that, especially when you're not, Crystal or Algae huge, where then, or like, what's his name? Andy Wallace, huge mixer, lives in upstate New York in like a barn in the middle of nowhere. But he's so big now, people will go to him. Like when you're starting out, you might have a small career, but I don't think it really works. And it's a debate with a lot of people whether or not you have to come to LA. In my opinion, I think it's hugely beneficial at the beginning of your career.
But how about, when you start out, I mean, what can students expect to charge if they're just coming to LA and they're working on demos or doing whatever they can do?
For me, I still just actually do day rates. So I mean, I'm kind of in the middle. So I book projects usually by day, or sometimes I'll do like a half day if it's going to be a thing. But it has gotten tricky. I've sometimes put my foot down, and since I'm not charging hourly, basically if it goes over 12 hours for sure, I'll be like, I got to charge you more, or we got to move this into another day.
Is there a rate? And I don't even know the number, but just is there a rate that everybody kind of knows? Oh, well, you're doing this Netflix show, so the day rate is basically this, and everybody kind of charges that same thing.
I mean, it's not as organized unless you're working on a union project. And right. For score mixers specifically, this is really specific to me and my little niche of score mixers. Like, it's weird for, like, I'm in the union, I pay dues, I paid a big initiation fee, but I almost never get to bill union because the productions consider me part of the music department, and composers are one of the only people left in Hollywood that are not unionized. So composers now get a package deal for everything. Basically, here's a hunk of money. You deliver us a score back. Any orchestra costs, musician costs, mixer costs, orchestrator costs, it's all up to the composer now. Whereas back in the day, I will talk to people like Tommy, who were here back in the day, who talked about, like, they would get their rate, and then everything else, like, you book the orchestra, bill it to Universal. Mixers, bill it to Universal. I know back in the day, like, Sean Murphy has he has like 100 mic collection, all like vintage, really expensive mics. When he did a session back in the day, he would get paid his day rate, and then he would also rent himself his own microphones and get to charge the studio. So those guys were making, I talked to them, they're like, the golden days are over, as they say. I mean, I never got to experience those, so the amount of money that I potentially can make now is, not nearly as good as they had it, but it's still good money, It's not like, we're, on the streets or anything like that. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, the union, for my rate, like if I charged the union rate, which I charge more than this, I think it's like 61 an hour is like the re-recording scoring mixer book rate with IATSE. We're IATSE. But I mean, you look at the top guys, the people that are dub mixers on the big films and things like that, and then Sean and Dennis, like, they make way more money than that. That's just like the minimum. So yeah, that's maybe a good starting point. It's really hard. I had a hard time figuring out what my, it's that funny. I don't know if you've seen that meme with like the two cowboys facing down, and there's the client saying like, what's your rate? And then the mixer saying like, what's your budget? Like, oh, who's going to go first? Like, you throw a rate out there, or do you throw out what the budget is? Yeah. I mean, for me now, I have a standard rate that I set on the high side, and I just throw that out there. But then I say like, well, if that, don't let that be a conversation stopper. If your budget's tight, we can negotiate. And pretty much every project now, I kind of negotiate. Right. And then my longtime clients like Danny and Sonder, we kind of have a rate that just everything is that rate, and it's a bit of a buddy rate, but they give me so much work, it's like it's advantageous for me in the end. But that's the hard thing too, and that's another thing I try to tell people just starting out is, really these days it's kind of a business in addition to being a mixer. You know, I have an LLC for all my work that I do. I got to figure out all of my write-offs and, you know, keep track of my expenses and, you know, manage my own invoices. And, you know, I hire an accountant to do the filing because that's, you know, a pain in the ass. But like you kind of have to approach it like you are running a business. And the way I book my time and move things around and the way I negotiate with clients for not only rates, but I'm constantly now, when people ask me what the hardest part of my job is, I always say scheduling. Like my schedule is such a pain in the ass because I'll have it perfectly laid out. I'll have like TV show, a film, a couple TV shows. It's like I have work, I have weekends off. It's all perfect. And then all of those shows change schedules. The 3 of them will be on top of each other, so I have to turn down one, or I have to try to ask client like, hey, like someone else is asking for this day. Can I do your mix a day earlier or a day later? I'm constantly juggling my calendar. It's tough. I mean, I might eventually hire a manager.
That's the nature of that business, isn't it? Because television and, I mean, especially movies, you know, there's the music goes on last, and then, you know, they run over in terms of shooting or whatever, or editing, and, you know, we got to re-edit something, and then, you know, we can't do the music until, you know, it's.
Yeah, well, and also like we're the sound and music are the departments that are kicked around all the time. Like, I can't tell you how many projects I've been on where we're delayed for, you know, weeks or months because VFX needs more time. But I've never been on a project where the sound team or the music, because visual effects needs more time to get their work done. I've never been on a project or heard of anybody been on a project where the composer or the sound designer's like, I need more time, and they push the date. That never happens for us. No. It happens for every other department, you know. Yeah, so yeah, we're at the mercy of that.
It's because music goes on last, right? It's the last thing.
Music and sound is the last thing to happen, and on some projects, if it's not a director, you know, like a Spielberg or someone who really cares about sound and music, sometimes it's almost an afterthought, or it feels like we're an afterthought. Like, oh yeah, just do the score and sound, and then just get it out, you know, get it in theaters, get our paycheck, you know. So yeah, scheduling, and that's a hard thing, and that's something I would suggest people look into earlier, because that can. I have friends. I don't totally hate that stuff. Like I kind of, you know, I guess I'm enough of a organizational nerd that I'm kind of okay managing my own, you know, expenses versus my invoices and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's not fun per se, but I kind of researched that stuff when I got out here, like what's the difference between an S corp and an LLC, and how should you organize and all that kind of stuff. You need to know, because I have friends who were in the same place as me, and then they started doing freelance work, but they were just, you know, spending their entire check and not saving any for taxes, and years later they're like in this mess, and then they have to learn on the fly how to sort of sort that out. So you can save yourself a lot of headaches ahead of time by kind of learning a system of how to manage all that. You know, I'm fresh enough that I still remember how important it was when I started out to talk with engineers that I admired and to assist them and work with them. And I'm at the point now where I've had enough success that I'm totally, you know, kind of excited to pass it on. And, you know, like Joe James still refers people to move out here, and he'll drop me an email a couple times a year and be like, hey, I got this new kid, just graduated, like he wants to get into post or film stuff, like can you meet up with him? And like I never have work because I'm like, you know, I don't really hire assistants yet, but I'm always down to grab coffee with people and, you know, just give them some pointers or have them come here and hang for a little bit and see what I do, because that's so important, is the sort of mentorship apprentice, you know, thing is still so huge in our industry.
If people are doing sessions, aren't they all working at home?
I guess now, yeah, I guess a lot of people do. Well, actually, that's funny that those are the people that are actually hanging now, because, you know, there's that's been a point of contention with a lot of the older orchestral players who are used to just doing orchestral sessions at a big scoring stage, AFM. And now these days, you know, a lot of people are doing non-union sessions from home, just doing soloist stuff. And I've talked to some old school, like legendary session players. They're kind of terrified of having to run their own business and to set up a company and do their own invoicing, because they've just been, you know, life was good when there was a lot of film score and record dates here for string players and woodwind players and brass players, and it was all AFM, so they would just, you know, that was easy. The AFM took care of all the paperwork. You just, you know, sign your documents, do the session, and then it just happens. But now, yeah, the session players that, especially people my age or, you know, maybe a little bit older than me, that are getting lots of work, yeah, I mean, it's like me. They've set up a studio, they record themselves. It's mostly all non-union. because the AFM kind of shot themselves in the foot with the way they handled video game contracts and like lower budget stuff, 15, 20 years ago. So basically every film studio now and television studio avoids the AFM like the plague because they're really hard to work with. Yeah. What is it? They're recording these RMA. The RMA and the AFM together, like the people at the top there, they have been so stubborn. And I get it, like big session musicians who have been playing on John Williams sessions and Jerry Goldsmith sessions for years on end, like, and have relied. I mean, I know violinists here that get like $200,000 checks, twice a year for back end from like E.T. and Jurassic Park and all these older projects, and they deserve it because they're phenomenal. But it's just not practical today. So I know a lot of musicians that are moving here to do session work. A lot of them aren't even joining the AFM because the AFM also threatens to penalize members for working on union dates, that's ridiculous. Like, we got to eat, So yeah, there's been a lot of drama, especially in the film scoring world with the AFM for about the last 10 years now. Because 10 years ago it was dry, like everyone left. Big projects would record in London because the British Musicians Union will do royalty free. Basically, they'll do a buyout, so they'll just pay the musicians a slightly higher rate, and then there's no back end.
Yeah.
And London, LA musicians don't want to hear this, but the musicians in London for orchestra sessions are just as good as the LA musicians. And they have Abbey Road and Air, and they have phenomenal studios. So that's why Marvel records their scores in London, because they can get a buyout. Like, the producers, they want a line item, orchestra costs this much, and then it's done. They don't want to think about, they try, and it's shitty. Like, people should be getting back end. I should be getting back end. Like, everyone works hard and does good work, but London does it. And then now we have, all these Eastern European orchestras that I work with a lot because they're so cheap, and there's obviously no back.
Poland is the big one, isn't it?
Not so much Poland. No, it's Bratislava, Prague.
I think that
there's some in Moscow now, Budapest, and they're actually, they were kind of a joke 10 years ago, and then the AFM was like, people are not going to go for these orchestras, don't play nearly as well, and it is true, they're not nearly as good as LA or London musicians, but they've gotten a lot better because they've gotten so much work. I can't bring myself to that. I feel like there's this thing too with a lot of composers and some engineers. I feel like it's more composers and artists. Like, they feel like because they got yelled at and they went through that crap when they came up and now they're successful, they feel like they got to do that to younger people to like condition them. I don't know. I can't bring myself to do that. I mean, there's been a few places where I've worked at some record studios in town where the assistants aren't quite up to snuff of what I want to be, and every now and then I'm like, maybe I should yell at them more, just a little bit. But no, ultimately, I mean, unless someone is maliciously, doing something bad, or someone's like tanking a session by just being lazy, or they're like intentionally just messing up and like throwing out the whole, then I would maybe get mad. But if someone's just made a simple mistake and it's because they don't know or they're still learning, because assistants at studios, they graduated Berklee or whatever, they have good skills, but they're still refining things, they're still learning. It might be a new console, they didn't work. Thankfully, I'm glad Berklee has Neves now, because I never touched a Neve before I moved out to LA. People are still learning though. I mean, like, if it's not actually like bringing the session to a halt, there's no reason to like freak out at people. And I've heard stories about certain people that it can be pretty bad to their interns and assistants, and I don't see the need for it.
Hey Phil, this has been great, man.
Yeah.
I'm gonna cut this up. I don't know, it's gonna take a while. This is gonna be fabulous. You're gonna be the star of my class for a while.
Oh, cool.
But great to see you, man. And look, when I come to LA next time, maybe I'll stop with the rental car in Culver City, and we can grab a coffee or something.
Yeah, I would love that. That'd be fun.
Okay, buddy. Hey, you take care, man, and I'll talk to you.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Okay, Phil. Bye-bye.
All right, take care, Marty.